So welcome, Ken Lin. So I'm really excited today to have Ken Lin, who is the founder and former CEO of Credit Karma. And we're here really to talk about the journey of Credit Karma, and then also talk about some of the formative moments coming up to the building of that business, and then also incredible exit to Intuit that happened kind of roughly 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And Ken am I right? You just stepped down from operating within Intuit.
Yeah. So first, thanks for having me here. Yeah. So I'm 90 days into my new life of not operating. But about 4 years ago, we closed the deal. And, 90 days ago, I decided to finally close the last chapter and walk away and spend some time with my family and kids.
And it's been a sort of epic 15 plus year journey. Maybe we go, and we've known each other loosely for a little bit of the second half of that. Maybe go back way back in terms of the origin story. Like, how did you come up with this idea to kind of find yourself to start this business? And were you always entrepreneurially minded or thinking about doing startups and tech?
Yeah, well, I mean, so one of the great things is my family, right? And my parents were first generation immigrants. So we came over to the U.S. We lived in Las Vegas of all places, and they were always hustling, right? Meaning that they were always working multiple jobs. They were sort of starting businesses on the side, whatever they could do to try to make ends meet. And I think in many ways that rubbed off on me in terms of the way that I thought about things. So I went to school in Boston University. I stayed there for about 10 years after school, and I came out to the Bay Area in 2004. And as I got here, um, I worked for eLoan, which was an online mortgage company that you may be familiar with. And I was working in the marketing department, and I realized that, hey, we actually were pretty good at digital marketing. And this is, sort of right after the dot-com bust, but really the resurgence of internet in many ways. And I decided to go out on my own and start a marketing agency based on the work that I was doing at eLoan, based on, I think we were good performance marketers. And somehow we found a niche in digital marketing for financial services companies. So one of my first customers was Prosper, which Chris Larson started. And, he has a fabulous story as well. But he hired me at Prosper to do a lot of the marketing and, really started there. And before I knew it, we were running $40-50 million worth of digital marketing for a lot of financial services companies. So like Wells Fargo, Prosper, Liberty Mutual. And something crossed my mind, which was the financial profile of the consumer was really important in the success of the marketing, right? So to give you a very simple idea, if American Express was looking for a customer, well, if the customer's credit score is too low, American Express couldn't underwrite them. If they were middle, again, they might or may not want them, but it was really on the high end for American Express that they really cared. And as a result, half to 2/3 of those marketing dollars were ineffective because they couldn't market to the right type of person. So going back to my direct mail days, my credit card days, I said, well, if you knew the credit score of the consumer, you would really be able to, be much more effective. And at the same time, in 2006, 2007, there were these dancing pirates that would talk about getting your free credit score, but it wasn't actually free because they would charge you, $20 a month in a subscription service once you try to get your free credit score. So we said, well, if we could actually cross these two models, we might have something special here. And that was the impetus of Credit Karma, which was let's actually give away the credit score for free. We think it's one of the more defining, components of your financial life. And at the same time, the data and sort of the profile about the consumer will really be, important in the future, in the present, of understanding the right types of financial services products. So the idea of Credit Karma was born in 2006, 2007. So in a lot of Starbucks and a lot of conversations.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, I remember the era because I was running Trulia at the time, and then Experian and Free Credit Report were kind of huge advertisers, and it's just like comedic, kind of like attention grabbing advertising. But it's sort of, I guess it, I don't know how much involved, but there's a high correlation between caring about your credit score and big ticket purchases, right? It's like, which, whether you're buying a house or buying a car, you kind of know that if your credit score is high, then it makes a meaningful difference to your ability to buy stuff. Was that always the business model? Was it always like, okay, get people in with a free credit score and then sort of transfer them through to particular offers?
So there was a small pivot. I still have the business plan somewhere, in Google, in the Google Cloud. I think when we started, the idea of Credit Karma is we thought that we would actually be able to help consumers save on their phone, their cable services, sort of subscription services that were credit adjacent, meaning if you're higher credit, you're more likely to pay your cable bill. If you're higher credit, you're more likely not to throw the equipment away, right? So that was the original thesis. But what we found was that, to your point, people who were coming to check their credit scores were actually just in market for financial services products, right? And I would categorize them in a 1 to 3, which was, they were just curious, which is an easy one. They were in market for a product, or they were really, wanting to improve their finances so that they could be in product, right? So the latter two obviously were really important in terms of our business model. And I think that was a correlation that we saw pretty early, and we realized, wow, all of these members who are coming in are in one of those 3 categories, and said, well, let's go and put a few of these offers up. And I think, for us, that was one of the first things that we did, and probably a smart thing, because we were super scrappy, super efficient. So, we went out to some of the affiliate sites and quickly just got a couple of financial services offers on our site. We stripped out all the, sort of the HTML and the graphics, if you will, just turned them into hyperlinks and talked about the offer and why we thought it was good for them. And that really took off. And that was a little bit of the early days of the business model, of figuring out what resonated with our consumers, but more importantly, led to the pivot away from, the cable and the credit to, the cable and the satellites type services.
More into lead gen.
Yeah.
Type. And like, one of the remarkable things about your story, although you raised a lot of money later on, you raised kind of next to nothing at the beginning, and I believe also that you were kind of a distributed remote team at the beginning. Maybe you'd share a little bit about the first year or so, like how you got things going.
Yeah, I mean, so it was really cool. We were effectively 3 people in completely different geographies. So I had the idea.
Just so you know, it's like we don't have a blanket black and white rule, but at NFX we're like, that's almost like a yellow flag, if not a red flag.
Well, I think that for us it was more of the scrappiness, right? I mean, if I had it to do it all over again, I would not have done that. But I think a little bit of for us was that we didn't have much funds, we didn't have an office, and people were already in different geographies. Yeah. So it was like, well, we could move everyone out here, but that would cost money. So I started the company. I had the idea, and Nicole Mustard was sort of the first person I called, and I had worked with her when she was at Compete. Smart BD person, really understood the internet. And I remember the conversation. She was in LA at the time. I met her at the St. Francis West End, and I remember having a conversation with her in the lobby. And in the moment, she said yes. I mean, it was amazing in the sense that she had no idea what I was going to ask her, had never described the business to her, never really understood the opportunity. But she said yes, which was fantastic. That got us started. And then our, chief technology officer, Ryan Graciano, was a friend of a friend. He was, working at IBM, and I asked the friend who he knew from a technology perspective. And he said, oh, you should just talk to this guy, Ryan. And what I just find amazing about those two is, here are 2, I don't want to say random people, but 2 people who didn't know each other, who barely knew me in some ways. We connected, we had an idea, and all the way up to the exit, 17 years later, they were still at Credit Karma running their respective departments, right? And I don't think that happens every day, but I think a lot of it is, the luck, the perseverance of having a great team to build these companies.
How much money did you raise at the beginning? Like, what was and I'm guessing you're pretty you were profitable pretty early on.
We were, and this is the thing that I always found, to be one of our secrets. So the very early days were really hard because to give you a little bit of context, we started in 2007, but 2008, 2009, the Great Recession happened. Yeah. So the early funding was me and an angel investor, and we thought that, hey, we have the great traction and the progress that we need, the metrics that we need to go and raise this, like a reasonable Series A. But unfortunately, Great Recession happened and all financing dried up. And, as a matter of fact, most banks felt like they were also going to be insolvent or going under. And that was a time frame that we were trying to fundraise in. So very tough period for us. We really just kind of tightened our belts and continued to operate and try to be as nimble as we could. I remember I didn't take a salary for a long time. I remember, again, we were working from our relative homes. We didn't have an office for a long time. And we were roughly a team of, probably like 4 full-time people and 2 or 3 contractors. But to your point about being efficient, one of the things that we did early again was to really start trying to monetize. And the good news is, I think through our first year or so, we were only burning a few $100,000 a year, which I think is pretty uncommon. Yeah, which is pretty uncommon in most startups. And that led us to a couple of amazing things. We raised something like $1.4 billion, $1.5 billion over the course of the history of Credit Karma. But when I look at our cumulative losses, particularly from the early days, I think we only needed about $5 million worth of capital to build that business, right? So we were never more than net negative about $5 million as we built the business. And that, I think it's a little bit of the carryover. I was at a .com in the late 90s and I saw the excess, the exuberance of what happens when you just kind of spend blindly and think that the revenues are going to come in. So I think we had a very good handle on the business. And I think that saved us in so many ways because, if we weren't like that, we would have never made it through 2008, 2009.
And you just think in retrospect, like not being able to raise, because you might have been able to raise, but you just literally couldn't raise, was a strength in retrospect rather than slowed you down. It might have felt like slowing you down in the short term.
Yeah. I think in the moment, it never felt like it was like, oh, this is going to build character. At the moment, it was a lot of lost nights of sleep and just feeling like, everything that we worked for was coming to an end. But I think to your point, it really made us focus on sort of the operating metrics of the business. And I think there is, to me, that is one of the core components of how I like to operate. And build businesses, which is to be super efficient. And if it's not working subscale, it's not going to necessarily work at scale or probably won't work at scale. So it forced us to be smarter in everything that we did. It forced us to be scrappy. I'll share a little bit of a story and give you an example of how this plays out. And it ended up being one of the defining moments for Credit Karma. So we had been working on the project for, roughly 2 or 3 years. We had, I can't remember if I actually don't think we'd raised our Series A yet, or maybe just had raised our Series A, which was all of $2 million. But most importantly, as context, we built the business to where we got unit economics. So for every user that we had, every member that we had, we would roughly generate $1 in revenue, and it cost us roughly $1 of operating between buying the credit data, the servers, and so on. So now the question was going to be, how do we actually build a user base, right? And we had about $1 million in the bank. And my past life in my marketing agency, I'd worked with Hill Holiday. So I called up one of the guys I knew at Hill Holiday and said, hey, I have $1 million. Here's my new business, Credit Karma. We'd really like to figure out if we can scale the business. And we thought maybe television would work because search and digital is so expensive in this category. And remember, the conversation was, well, if you want to try television, you'll probably need to do a creative that'll cost you $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, and then you'll probably want to spend another $200,000, $300,000 in actual media, and then maybe you'll get a read as to whether that is going to be slightly effective. And of course, I'm weighing my $1 million in the bank and the fact that he just said you have to spend $600,000 to build a campaign. So we quickly decided that was not going to be a good idea. But what we did instead is we took my DSLR. We got 3 or 4 employees. They were sort of hand actors. They were never on camera. We bought some props, maybe $30, $40 worth of props. And then we shot a commercial on my camera. Well, the only thing that we did that was professional is we rented a professional sound studio just so we could do the voiceovers. And we did a commercial for, let's just say $500 all in between the props. $500 versus the $300,000 or $400,000. And at the time, there was this thing called Google Television Auction, which you could actually just bid on, remnant inventory anywhere in the United States at various time slots. So that was the idea. And I remember this very well. So uh, it was the day after Christmas, and I got this email. We used to call them good hour emails, which would be, hey, it's a good hour if it's more than the average number of registrations. And I saw the email. I was like, day after Christmas, no big deal. Maybe some news outlet picked it up. So, carried on with my day. Then the next day at 11:05, again, this is now, I think, Wednesday, I get the same email. And that's weird because that doesn't normally happen with news cycles, right? Because they don't repeat. So I remember calling Greg, who was leading our marketing at the time, like, hey, what's with this spikes? And I remember him saying to me, it's like, I think it was television. And, and for us, it was like maybe 100 registrations within that hour, which was pretty good for us. And, my question then to him is like, well, how much did we spend for that spot that, caused a blip in registrations? And the dollar amount is what blew my mind. It's roughly $50. Whoa. So we basically got 100 incremental registrations for $50, right? So effective CPM or CPA of 50 cents. And we were very quiet about this because we're like, is this right? And how scalable is it? And the short answer is very scalable. So for us, we went from spending $0 in television to something like $250 million a year the next year because we were the biggest buyer of this remnant inventory.
So you went from 0 to 200 million in a year.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Because we were getting something like 2 to 3 month paybacks, right? When cost of acquisitions are 50 cents, you don't have to have these users long on your platform. And going back to this idea of unit economics, right? We were roughly break even, but now all of a sudden we're getting all these users, and now we have the leverage to negotiate better deals with all of our partners.
Yeah.
So as we're growing more and more users, and these are high quality credit users who are like looking for products, our advertisers are willing us to pay us more and more and more. So, we're sort of growing the number of users. Our costs are going up marginally, but more importantly, our margins per user are increasing drastically because now we're getting scale.
Yeah, it's such a it's in every breakthrough startup they break some rules, and I think it was at the time like, I was running Trulia and there was a sort of narrative like, why would any smart marketer use television? Because it's untrackable. You can't sort of, you can't target the creative effectively. It's like, the old adage, 50% of your marketing is wasted. You just don't know which 50% it is. And I think it's like that unconventional thinking was instrumental because you wouldn't have had the same economics and opportunity if you went through traditional media.
Yeah.
So traditional digital media.
Well, absolutely, right. I mean, to go context, because the other players in the space were so profitable, they're making $20, $30, right? So the CPC at the time for terms like free credit score were like $3, right? Yeah. So even if I had 100% conversion on the $3 per click that I was paying to get the traffic, which you're not going to get 100% conversion, right?
Yeah.
It would still have been 6 times more expensive than what we had found in television, right? And it goes back to this idea of again, being unconventional. And I think there's a fair amount of luck and trial and perseverance in this,
and maybe economically as well at the time. This was 2009?
2012.
2012. Okay, yeah. You scaled up. Okay. And it's still like, there was like, economically, the environment was, media was still pretty cheap.
It was, yeah, and television, right? And because this is the time, to your point, everyone was going all in on television, and as we know, offline media is still very performant. What are we, 12 years later? But back then, everyone thought there was this, transition that was happening. So everyone wanted to be in digital, which really allowed us to kind of go against the trend and be in offline media, which again really played out. But, back to the idea of luck, part of it was surprising for me was luck in the sense that, that television commercial was so performant. We tried 2 other commercials right afterwards and they bombed. They didn't have anywhere near the same response rates as the first commercial.
$500 one.
Yeah. And what we then did was we went back and we said, oh, what do we believe are the thesis or sort of the distillation of the key components that made a difference? And then we figured out the formula. And, for us, we then try to leverage what we thought was both the formula of what made for a good television commercial for us and the fact that we were being scrappy. So we would shoot, you know, 5 to 6 commercials per month, all in-house. Never used an agency, never used, sort of professionals. I remember we were using Craigslist to find talent. I mean, like we would literally go onto Craigslist and say, hey, we're looking for somebody to be in a national television commercial because we didn't want any SAG actors at the time because we couldn't afford to pay the residuals and so on, right? Again, we were being super scrappy.
It sort of reminds me a little bit of Costco. Like Costco it sort of comes across like a sort of lower end brand in when you go into the store, but then you actually like dig behind it and it's like they just spend money on the right things. And you as a premium, but the audience that goes into Costco is massively premium. For the folks that spend money there. And so I think maybe just the scrappiness actually was attractive to some of your customers that they felt but you were a brand that was spending money on the right places.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's what we really focused on, right? I mean, our offices weren't luxurious. And if you look at the first 5 or 6 years, I would say, aside from the marketing dollars, we were spending all the money buying data. I mean, we were the largest consumers of credit information, I think bigger than any banks. I mean, I actually remember having a meeting with Jamie Dimon a while ago or, many years ago. And we were actually talking about, the amount of money that we spend. And I was like, I think we're the biggest, buyer of credit data. He's like, we're Chase. I bet you we spend more. So I told him our number. And I appreciate the fact that he knew how much he spent. He's like, no, you're right. You actually spend more than we do. But I was surprised that he actually knew that number, given how large JP Morgan is. But yeah, at the time, we were spending a lot of money on credit data.
So and obviously you're, part of the business is working with the credit bureaus. Like, I'm curious how those relationships evolved over time and any sort of pivotal moments there.
Yeah, I mean, I have a great story in this one. So, we found the idea of Credit Karma in 2007. We'll buy credit scores. We'll give it away for free. We just got to build the site. The relationships and the data should be easy. That was where I was wrong. So, we called all 3 of the bureaus. And funny enough, each bureau would say, like, we're not taking on new customers now. We would describe our model, what we're trying to do. Can you help us? Can you tell us how to, buy your data? And every bureau would say, well, we're not taking on new customers. Go talk to the other 2 bureaus. I'm like, well, that's weird. So luck would have it, as I worked at eLoan, we had a TransUnion representative at eLoan who I called because I'd worked with him while I was there and said, hey, here's what I'm thinking. Here's the business model. No one's willing to work with me. Is there a way that you could help me get a contract with TransUnion? So he sends me like a 2 or 3 page form, what's the purpose, address, simple stuff. Submit it. And he's like, you're approved. Here's here's the API, here this is the documentation, and off we go. And our, Ryan is coding based on it. So we get the site up and running. And we're sort of in stealth. We're just building the technology for about a year. And I don't think about the contract anymore because, it's a done deal. So we build the site. I go on vacation after a year's worth of development. We put the site, sort of like on friends and family access, which means like, hey, it's basically working. We're trying to take a little bit of a pause before we really go into the heart of marketing and trying to build this business. And it was my first time in Thailand. The phones aren't very good. I remember Nicole calling me and she said, hey, we're on the page of the American Banker, which is really a business, publication. It's a small blurb, all of like a paragraph, right? Talking about Credit Karma is giving away free credit scores. Don't think anything of it. Well, on my way back from Thailand, which is like an 18-hour flight, I land in LAX and my phone is blowing up. And what had happened was, and back then, like in the very early years, I literally got an email for every registration. So I'd land and like for half an hour, I'd just go ding, 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 right? So I call Nicole and say, hey, what happened? I was just on a trip. And she's like, well, funny story. That American Banker conversation led to somebody putting the code onto Slick Deals. And at the time, Slick Deals is this great deal site, and we were on the front page, and we had a code that was that would sort of limit the amount of people that you could get onto the site, but somebody had actually put the code onto Slick Deals. So we've got about 6,000 registrations in that time frame. So that was a real great high for us. Now I want to talk about the low, which is like 2 days later. I'm sitting in our offices, and we get an unexpected UPS package, right? An
Okay.
overnight. And the overnight was a termination notice. So what had happened was, the article and the subsequent traffic led to TransUnion noticing and pulling up our contract. And they realized that, well, if these guys were fraudulent, like we told them exactly what we were going to do in our contract, but the reality is no one read the contract, it just improved the deal, right? So their recourse was, well, they have the 30-day right of termination. So they pulled the trigger on that and said, well,
But you were paying them.
we were paying them. We were paying our
In
bills.
many respects, they were like, this, your success is our success.
You would think that, but you have to keep in mind that all of the bureaus are making a lot more money from the subscription product, right? The free credit score, monitoring service. So in many ways, we were super competitive to that cash cow. And, I know this in hindsight, at TransUnion specifically, there was a consumer division that, we went around. So the person in charge of this,
You're disruptive to them.
yes, we're disruptive to them, but also they were in charge of, direct to consumer business, and, our contract went around them. So we got the termination notice, and I went from this high of like, wow, we really have product consumer fit here, market fit, right? To, oh my gosh, in 30 days, they're going to shut down our business. And, the 14, 15 months worth of work that we've put into this business to this product is going to be gone. So, I called everyone I knew. I, was like desperate to say, who can help me? Who made this decision? How do I get in touch with the powers that be at TransUnion? I forget who the person was, but somebody said to me, I think the person you need to talk to is John Danaher. And I remember, and like, I can't even make an introduction for you. I think I have their email address. So I remember writing a cold email, right? Like, hey, John, you don't know me. I started this little company. Here's a little context. I'd really love to talk to you about the opportunity. We think we're onto something special. And true to form, John, who we're great friends now, responded, and he said, hey, listen, I'm going to be flying through San Francisco on my way to SLO. That's where one of their offices are. Like, why don't we go and meet for breakfast? And I remember this was about a week before the 30 days are up. So this is basically like 23, 24 days into the termination notice. He responds and we meet. And I remember it was the most sleepless night of my life in terms of Credit Karma, because I knew it was such an important meeting for me. But we had breakfast, and I had convinced him that, based on the traction that we had, that there was an opportunity for us to build something, and that we should partner. And I convinced him to do that. And, the rest is history, as they say.
And so they were like, they were comfortable betting on you, even though it would be perhaps detrimental to some of their other relationships and some of their internal, big picture thinking from them, but it's obviously surprising as well.
Yeah, I mean, over the course of the 17 years, John and I became really good friends, and he let me know into a little bit of the psychology. I think there are two things that really swayed him. I think one he shared was this idea that, hey, you guys actually had traction. You were able to generate, at that point, we probably had 20 or 30,000 users, right? In the time that we launched and got the termination notice and coming close to it. And he's like, pretty amazing that you had no marketing dollars and able to get all these users on your platform. So that was the first thing to notice. And sometimes it reminds me of the idea that, forgiveness is better than permission, right? Because we kind of went a circuitous route in terms of getting the agreement done. But the second thing is what he confided in me. It was like, I thought we would have bought you, over the years, right? And that was what it was going on his mind, is if they're successful, we'll just buy this company. And, if they're not, then, no harm, no foul. And what was interesting is, and, I think companies tend to have a lot of luck along the way. I think for them, they were a private company that was about to go public. They had a lot of things that they had to do internally in terms of getting the company ready to go public. So I think these things just kind of, passed by them. And, we were growing rapidly and almost in a blink, the chances of them buying us for a reasonable price, right? Probably, some tens of millions of dollars, went very quickly because as we got traction, obviously your multiples tend to change based on growth rates. And I thought we probably made it outside of their comfort zone pretty fast.
Yeah, but it's probably, it's very, and we'll touch on the kind of M&A stuff later, but it's probably an interesting sort of tactic for startups in the finding kind of the strategic sponsors within companies that are not perhaps blinkered by the short term of kind of, okay, I need to just do the basics, but really thinking strategic. Okay, this is a company that we should align ourselves with. This could be helping us in various different forms. Is really important to help a founder navigate some of these pivotal moments as they go through things. Before we talk about the M&A stuff and potential and even possible IPO, just want to touch on culture. You mentioned earlier that your co-founder's been with you for 17 years. Like, there must have been a bit of a special culture in the organization which you built, and I'm curious how you thought about that and how you built that.
Yeah, I mean, it brings a smile to my face because it's one of those things that you become really proud of. And maybe in the moment you don't recognize how special it is. But as I've stepped away from the business, I mean, one source of pride for me is just kind of hearing from past Karmanauts, people who've worked at Credit Karma. Karmanauts, that's what we call one another. People who've worked at Credit Karma, and they just, all reflect on how great and how wonderful our culture was. And I think for many founders, and myself included, I didn't think about these things. So let me talk about it from my perspective. I didn't necessarily think about culture as anything special in the beginning, right? I always thought like culture is like, it's these words that you put on the wall that don't really mean a lot. But over the years, what I really learned was, culture was the way that you showed that you cared for one another. And that was the cohesion of a company. And I think it was probably like year 6 or 7, we had a little bit of a crisis in the sense that, once you start.
And what year was this roughly?
So this is probably 2013, 14.
Yeah.
Right. So we're 7, 8 years in. And what I found is that once you don't know everyone's names, once people aren't in the meetings with the leadership, you don't then know how to treat one another, right? You can't sort of role model like, hey, we don't yell at each other. We really care about other people's opinions. They're all valued in those types of aspects. And I think we started losing. And at the same time, this is when we're hyperscaling, right? So you're getting expertise, you're getting people from Google, you're getting from these and they're great companies, but they don't know the culture of the company. And I remember we had I don't want to say a crisis, but we had a moment where we really had to really think about what type of company, what type of culture do we want to be? Do we want to be missionaries or do we want to be mercenaries, right? Yeah. Do we care about the mission first and foremost, or do we care about making a bunch of money? And, it was at that moment that we really thought about, hey, we have always been focused on the user. We've been focused on one another and making sure that this is a great place to work. We can be proud of our work and that we're doing the right things for both our members and one another. And I think it was through that we really, distilled and solidified what our culture is, which is, one of caring, one of empathy, one about making progress each and every day and understanding that. So, we had our, sort of the 4 or 5 key things that we thought about, and we just started talking about it, and we started working with, our onboarding teams and make sure like, hey, let's make sure we codified these. Let's make sure that we actually operate these ways. I mean, it's one thing to think about culture, but I think you also have to be authentic. I think a lot of times people think about, culture as being something like, oh, I want our culture to be this way. But if you're not authentic about it, if you don't behave that way, if you don't role model it, it doesn't play out that way. And, again, even to this day, 17, 18 years later, people talk about the experience that they had at Credit Karma being special because of our culture and the way that we thought about the business model, our members, and one another.
Yeah, and it could, the nature of your industry, there's a lot of organizations which are like seemingly terrible cultures, that are like lead gen businesses, that are kind of financial services businesses. But I think it also, just from my observation, extends into the brand as well. Like the brand that you built, which is so powerful, is also a function of the team that you built.
Yeah, I mean, I remember one story, going back to this moment of near failure, and I think it helped solidify really the standard by which we were going to operate. Was, this is 2009, 2010. We're quickly running out of money, and I remember trying to fundraise, number one, but two, we were on the verge of going out. And I remember just having a conversation with the team and said, I don't know if we'll be able to fundraise. But there's a moment here where we could fundamentally like spam our members to generate more revenue. We could sell the data to generate more revenue. And I said, you know what? I never liked those companies. I don't want to work at one of those companies. So I remember we as a leadership team decided that we wouldn't do those things and that we would rather just go out of business than get into the model and sort of the business practices that we despised. I think it became a defining moment for us and our culture and the way that we operated, because if we were willing to bet the farm,
Yeah.
on something like that, it gave us a sense as we became more profitable and more successful that, well, that's just another example of that. And by the way, this is much smaller stakes now, right? Like, great, we leave some hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table, or maybe even millions. That's nothing compared with the existential decision that we made way back in the day. So it was a foundation for us.
Yeah. You touched on briefly, like TransUnion was kind of, in retrospect, sort of sniffing around to kind of potentially acquire you. Tell me, and then you raise a bunch of money from investors who are kind of looking for a return. And obviously you didn't start the company to sell the company, and you started the company to help millions of people. But there comes a point where you'll probably be thinking, okay, multi-billion-dollar enterprise, IPO or acquisition. And I think you wrote something a while ago which was sort of quite negative on on kind of IPOs. So firstly, I'd love to kind of your thought process. Okay, do we go public, because you probably could have done, or do we think about some sort of combination with another entity? I'd love if you share kind of how you thought about those two paths.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I wrote an article a while back that talked about how I thought IPOs were they're a financing event, right? And I think a lot of founders go into business thinking like, hey, my end goal is either to go public or to be sold. And I think over the course of Credit Karma, I realized that was not my goal. My goal was to build an enduring business that could really change the landscape of financial services for consumers, all for the better. And I think when you have that as your vision, as your end goal, right, the way you operate is fundamentally different, which led to the article of why I thought like, hey, an IPO is not my end goal, is not what I think about from Credit Karma. I think about how do we change the landscape. And I think to the chagrin of some of our investors, like, well, where's the liquidity? How do we get to the end of that?
Did they contact you and say like?
No, I mean, they knew me from the board meetings. They knew me from the engagements, and in every one of those meetings that you're taking funds from, you give a time frame. And I said, listen, I think this is the way we've operated. I don't think this is anything new. But I wanted to be very clear to the employees about like what we were trying to do, that the vision and the mission that we were on was more important than the next exit. Now, to be completely fair as well, those that billion plus of fundraising that we did over the years, we're to create liquidity for employees too, right? So that you're not in a situation where you have this like equity value that's locked up that nobody can access. So we wanted to find the right balance of the two. So it's not like I had my head in the sand in terms of what was important, but that was the way that we've operated the business. And at the same time, I always thought about being pragmatic, right? Meaning that, listen, there can't be a dogma to running a business. For some, there can be, but for me, I was always about weighing all the various options and looking at things and, what's negotiable, what's not negotiable. So that was the context of I thought of, a public offering as a financing event, not the end goal.
It's interesting because I think you read that article in 2014, if I remember. Like,
That sounds about right.
and it's yeah, Trulia went public in 2012, and as you say, it's like a finance event, sure, but we couldn't raise money in the private markets in an up round, but the public markets were very receptive. And I think that was 2012, that there was just all this money sitting on the sidelines, which I think it may be the situation soon in the private markets and the public markets can be quite frothy. But I think it changed a couple of years later. That is, I think a lot of the kind of growth rounds came in low interest environment, and so it's like you could actually raise a lot of money in the private markets.
You're absolutely right around that, right? Because for us, we were catching the fintech wave, right? We were fintech didn't exist as a term when we started, but we were the fast growing business in that round. And to your point, all of a sudden, there were billions of dollars on the sideline in the private markets, and people were willing to write us, $500 million checks, and over 3 weeks of diligence or 3 months of an S1 filing, right? So you look at the comparable of those two things and you say, well, if I'm going to do a financing event, would I rather do the route of an IPO, or would I actually do a series, D or E? So that also led into a little bit of the psyche for us. But, sometimes timing, luck, again, execution, all those things do matter. But you're right. There were so many dollars that it was easier for us to do a private round and not have to subject ourselves to, all the scrutiny and or, the publicity sometimes of being a public company.
And so as a private company, I suspect you had a number of kind of suitors that were getting close to the company over years. Like, how was whether that's Jamie Dimon or whether that's other credit bureaus, how was that process, and how did you think about it?
I think it always goes back to being, one, again, pragmatic. And for me, it was never about this one thing or bust. It was always looking at, the dynamics that existed. So over the years, we certainly had a few inbounds, but our ambitions I think were always a little bit higher than the ambitions or the vision of the people who were calling. But we would always take the time to vet whether it's like, this is a real thing, how material is it, and the one, again, non-negotiable that we focused on was like, how mission aligned is this idea, right? How mission aligned is this company with what we were trying to do? So I think that was the first test for us. And nothing really ever came about those opportunities until a little bit of the conversation that we had with Intuit, many years into the founding of Credit Karma.
And was that sort of like, how did that relationship form? Because it's a very big decision for you, but also a very big decision for them. Like, what was the dating process?
Yeah, so connections, networks do matter quite a bit. So I had a good friend, James Kim, who said, "Hey, I know the head of business development at Intuit, Anton. And I think you guys should just meet for coffee," right? And it's as simple and as innocent as that. And of course, there's probably a little bit of subtext to it, but, Anton and I meet. And, Intuit was very, what I thought was interesting was sort of 2 or 3 things stand out for me. Was one, as part of the introductions often have, is like, you talk about your company, but, the other company tends to reciprocate and talk about their vision and what really mattered. And one of the things that struck me in that very early meeting was that while we used different words, we actually had a lot of the same vision in place. Now, context of that is, we had started a tax business. They had started a Credit Karma competitor, right? So like, we were moving in the same direction. But I thought that was really interesting, because I thought that was one of the things that really mattered to me. But the other thing that stuck out to me was that they were a very big and slow moving organization, right? So I remember having a meeting, didn't hearing from them for, like 6 weeks. They were like, "Hey, really interesting meeting. Would love to learn a little bit more. Could we ask you a few more questions?" And, sure, we gave them some answers, and they go off, and another, 6 to 12 weeks later, you don't really get a good response. And that's fine, because we weren't focused, we didn't think of it as being a selling opportunity. Is more of like, yeah, we're happy to share what we're doing.
And you were sharing just from a sort of BD development, but to try to build a relationship with them, or where you could learn from them? I'm just curious why you invested, because a lot of founders would like avoid corp dev, biz dev folks at big corporations. They slow you down, but
Yeah.
obviously in this case, it led to something quite interesting.
We didn't know where it was going to go, right? But this is sort of the culture and the way that we operate at Credit Karma generally, which was, we would, we have amazing business partners over the years, and they would all start from these types of conversations, right? Like, whether it was TransUnion or the various banking institutions that we had really close relationships with them. So we didn't know if this was going to be a business development deal, a lead gen partnership deal, an M&A deal, right? But there are obviously areas where we were all playing for, whether it was the same customer or the same industry. So you don't know how it's going to develop. So we were open-minded about it. And, at some point it crosses certain questions we're not going to answer, margin questions or our growth rate questions, but we can certainly give you a perspective of how efficient we are or where we're focused. So I know something like 4 or 5 months go by, and then out of the blue, they give me a call and say, "Hey, we've been poring over the data, and we'd love to make an offer for the business."
So 2019?
This is actually about 2017, 2018.
Okay.
And so they threw out a number, and it didn't meet my threshold. And I think Sasan, who's the CEO of Intuit, still talks about this story today. So, I told him politely, he tells the story like I told him to go take a hike. I didn't say that. But I politely declined the offer and said, I just don't think this actually values Credit Karma in terms of the opportunity that we're trying to create and the vision that we're trying to do. And I appreciate the synergies and I actually think those are really interesting, but I'm just not interested. And I remember, he's like, what, not even a counter offer or rebuttal? I'm like, no, you're just not in the right ballpark. So anyways, I politely declined the offer, and we went about just kind of running the business. And it was about 18 months later that Sasan called me out of the blue. And he said, "Okay, I've been thinking about this, 18 months of thinking, or, roughly that time period of thinking." And he came back with another number, right, which was more in the zip code that I was thinking about. And that started the process of us sort of having ongoing conversation. That led to a little bit more of a negotiation. And I remember he called me actually, I think the day before Thanksgiving. I remember because we were in the Maldives of all places. It was my wife and I's 10th anniversary. We were in the Maldives. We were flying back, and I remember I was having dinner with her. I'm like, I need to take this call, So I stepped out of dinner, and he'd sort of got to sort of the outline of what he was thinking, and from Thanksgiving until the new year, we were working on the term sheet. And then from the term sheet, we were working on the definitive agreement that ultimately was announced, I think February 24th. So sort of, a month worth of term sheet and 2 months of sort of definitive agreement.
And how did you the conversation with your co-founders? How did that go? Because obviously you've been in it together for at least a decade at this point.
That was 19, right? So we'd been together for 12, 13 years at that point. I think it goes back to trust, rapport, culture, right? And, they'd known me over those years to be very pragmatic. We'd had liquidity events in terms of, secondary opportunities along the way. But I think the conversation really was one of, honesty and, sort of vulnerability, which is like, hey, I think we're mission aligned. And I think there's an opportunity here, and we could sort of go on our own. But if you really thought about, we bought a tax company, we think, let me start with the vision, which is we think having the full profile of a consumer is the way that we can help them. And the thing that we were missing over the years is we actually had the credit side. So we had the liabilities of most consumers, but we actually didn't have the other side of the balance sheet, right? We didn't have the income. We didn't actually have sort of the cash flow. But if we had those pieces, now we could actually understand a consumer's financial life and really help them holistically and really understand what their needs are, how to help them save money. And we had been on the mission to sort of round out that whole balance sheet for the consumer. And here was Intuit at massive scale who could help us do that. And that was what I shared with them. And like, we could do this alone, but I know we're 3 years into our tax business and we've got like 2.5 million members. It's going to take us a long time to do this. And, Intuit has 30 plus, 33, 35 million plus tax filers each and every year. So, I think the mission and the opportunity aligned itself. And then, then it turned into a little bit of the, sort of the details of the deal. But I remember what mattered for us was, what do we really care about? What are our non-negotiables in the term sheet itself? As you know, term sheets can get quite long and lengthy, and the negotiation process can take a while. But I remember we thought about what are the 2 or 3 things that really matter for us? What are the non-negotiables? And let's see what happens if we can lock down the non-negotiables and see if there's a deal here.
And anything in the non-negotiables that you were able to share?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think there were really 3 things that ultimately mattered for us. I think one was the mission, right? What we were doing. That to me was the most important thing. If that didn't work, if that didn't play out the way that we wanted it to, we wouldn't do the deal. And when I say mission, I sort of put mission, agency, autonomy as sort of like all in one bullet. And we thought it was really important that we were able to continue what we were doing. And, one of the nice things that actually happened because of that non-negotiable is that we were effectively run as a, I'll say independent company for many years.
And you'd still be the CEO, and you'd have
Still be the CEO.
co-founders, and
I would just report into Sasan. My C team would continue to report into me. We would effectively run the business. And I think, and there were some carve outs, right? Because we were moving into a public company, ethics, compliance, finances like had to have its own path to go and make all of that work. And we figured those things out. But that was certainly one. The second one was employees. Like, I would not do the deal if the employees were cut, if they weren't treated right, if there was anything sort of negative associated with the deal. And the third one was just kind of the standard terms of the pricing, right? Like I already had a bogey in mind on what I thought about the value. But those were our 3 negotiables or sort of non-negotiables. And what somebody taught me early on was like, hey, the momentum of the deal, the fatigue of the deal, you will start caving in on things if you don't take a moment out to write what are your non-negotiables. What are the 3 things that when that line is crossed, you just won't do it? And it was, I think, really helpful in terms of the next, effectively like 8-9 weeks of nonstop, diligence and papering of the deal.
And how did you get comfortable with the culture? Culture is obviously very important to you, and we were talking before the show just around Scott Cook as just a legend within Silicon Valley, a friend of the firm, and he's just a terrific guy. And Intuit has a great culture, but it's probably less wacky, I think, than at least my understanding from the advertising of the Credit Karma culture.
Yeah, I think this is also extremely important in any sort of M&A deal, right? I mean, I think they'd done diligence on us, but for us to do diligence back was really spending time with their leaders and understanding how they operate, right? Is it a collaborative culture? Is it a competitive culture? Like simple things like that. Like we were always very collaborative at Credit Karma, and they are also at Intuit as well. But it's actually, keep in mind that from the time of the first engagement with Anton, I mean, something like 3 years it transpired. But in those 3 years, like I'd gotten to know more and more of those people. And then specifically from the time that Sasan called me the day before Thanksgiving, all the way up to, February 23rd, 24th, when we announced, I'd been going down there and meeting with them, meeting with all the various departments, really trying to understand. And I got quite comfortable with how they operated. And now, you don't exactly know, right? And you'll never exactly know in that process because it's a little bit of a sales process. It's a little bit of a, high level. But the good news is I got a sense of who the people were. I got a sense that they were aligned on the mission. And I think part of it goes back to like, you're testing for, hey, you told me this about how important this was. When you're 5 or 6 meetings later, you sort of have an opportunity, like, how do you think about this, right? And you want to have the same
back
answer.
And forth, a volley back and forth on different things. And did you, because when I was going through the Trulia Zillow merger, we were both public companies and we spent a lot of time together on similar stuff, but it would be these very awkward, like we'd have to get the private dining room at some restaurant, and you would arrive at 8 o'clock and we'd arrive at 8:15, and like and it'd be this sort of hush hush, dark glasses and kind of like disguises. I imagine similar stuff had to go on because you didn't want to necessarily leak it to the press or the employees.
Yeah, well, there was as much of that as we could do. The good news is we weren't two public companies that would cause more attention. But I remember, I think about 10 days prior to our announcing, the story was leaked to the Wall Street Journal. And I remember having that meeting, which was, what do we do? Right? I mean,
leaked by a banker, you think?
Well, to this day, I still don't
Okay.
know. Don't know who leaked it. Those are probably good guesses, by the way. But I remember, we're in sort of crisis mode of understanding what's going to happen. And I remember we said, well, no comment, right? That was our approach, which is like, we'll neither confirm nor deny this. As a private company, it didn't really matter to us so much. But for Intuit, as a public company, that has huge ramifications in terms of how it played out. But the good news is, it didn't really, we got a lot of inbounds, but I think Intuit's history of just no comment on these things and us also sticking by the no comment just made it kind of a nothing issue for a while.
That's exactly the same thing happened with Trulia and Zillow, and in retrospect, for me as the CEO, it was actually like a little bit of a pressure valve.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of like there'd been all this internal tension with the sort of executives, and you're trying to navigate this very it's a very complicated situation, and you're kind of at the final line, but you're actually trying to navigate how do you communicate this to kind of the constituents.
Yeah.
And in some ways it was like, okay, everyone kind of thought, is this going on? It kind of made sense, but we can't talk about it.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like, it was the fact we weren't talking about it, knew it was going to happen. And it sort of helped to sort of soften the blow a little bit, or kind of like help us to kind of tune the messaging about how employees would think about it. Similar thing.
You're totally right. And I think I misspoke when I said it didn't affect us, because that was where it did affect us, right? I mean, from an employee perspective, one is it put it out there in the ether that, okay, now it's a thing. I think it's one of those things that you can't ignore forever, but you can give it a little bit of time. And for us, that little bit of time was, roughly sort of a week to 10 days worth of, okay, great, it's out there. I have to respond to it, but I'm also at the same time, like, trying to, get the papers and make this deal happen. But to your point, it does kind of float the idea, and you can get a sense of the employee reaction.
Yeah.
And now you can craft your message, 10 days later in the all hands about, great, here's what some set of constituents are going to think. Here's what other people are going to think. And, it kind of helped me understand, okay, here are the things I'm going to have to address and talk about.
As you think back through this process, like, and maybe advice for founders, different stages of a startup journey, like, is there anything that you do differently or similarly, like, I'm so glad I did that because it kind of helped to kind of navigate. And again, it's like, you don't start a company to sell a company, but this stuff's important for all your different constituents.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a really interesting construct that hopefully will never ever happen again. But it goes back to the moral, which is like, sweat the details here, right? So we worked on this deal for roughly 3 months, but 2 months worth of papering. And we announced the deal the morning of February 24th. This is basically a week 2020, yes. So this is roughly a week before COVID lockdown happens, and the U.S. was getting scared about COVID, and the Dow futures were down 600 points that morning before the announcement. So it was sort of an ominous moment for us, but we decided, like, hey, the deals, we signed it early that morning, and we're ready to announce. So we announce. A week later, we're in lockdown. Now, in our deal, we have to go through DOJ. Well, most deals require DOJ review. And we thought there was a decent chance that we would have to have second review, which really means that, in addition to the 30 days that the DOJ needs, they're going to ask for more time to look at all the competitive aspects. I'm sure you had a version of that, right? But, while all of this is happening, COVID also happens to us. So we went from, I'll give you round numbers here, they're approximations. We went from roughly $100 million a month in revenue to something like $40 million a month in revenue. We were, instead of making 20 or $30 million worth of revenue, or netting in profit, we were like minus 40.
Whoa.
So, and yeah, and
And so
we
you-
signed we signed a definitive agreement, right? And the bottom falls underneath from your business, and Intuit is, like, I'm looking at Intuit, right? Like, what are you gonna do? And my board's looking at me, and they're like, Ken, you can't think that this deal is going to happen.
But it's the definitive deal is signed.
The definitive deal is signed, but
and
you have to
act
keep.
of God, or sort of like
There's two components that like all the legal counsel that you have around the table are thinking about, which is first a MAC, right? A material adverse effect or a condition, right?
Yeah.
And so they say, listen, they could just call that and say, listen, this is COVID is a MAC. That's the way out of the deal. And the other side of it is, like, you have to have a business continuity. Like, you have to run the business as you would have always run the business until close, right? So if you spent $50 million, $60 million a month in marketing, you have to keep spending $50, $60 million a month in marketing, right? Or that would be an out for them, right? So I'm trying to look at these two things. I'm like, what are they going to do? How should I run the business? And then at the same time, our investors are calling us and like, Ken, we think COVID is a 10-year thing. We think that this is a big deal. And to their, like, to be fair to them, like, this is April, May of 2020. Like, we had no idea. We had no idea what COVID was going to be. So I was really stuck with this dilemma of, okay, what do I do here? I've got investors who think I should lay off half the company and brace and, not expect the deal to go through. And at the same time, I'm kind of talking around the issue with Sasan. Like, I'm never really directly talking about, like, hey, are you going to close this deal, right? Because it's a weird conversation. And I remember just kind of thinking about what we do, and I remember I thought long and hard about it. And one of the smart things that investors had told me to do early on was, like, we should have a rainy day fund, right? And to the billion, 2, 3, 4 that we'd raised, we had about $500 million worth of cash in the bank, and we raised it for maybe an acquisition in the future or a rainy day. And I remember saying, well, we're raising dollars for a rainy day, right? And I'm not sure we're ever going to have a rainier day than this. So we made the decision. I made the decision in many ways that we were not going to lay off the company. We would do everything we could to rein in our expenses. We all took pay cuts. We, sort of any marketing that wasn't committed, we would pull back, and we would just really tighten the belt as much as we could. The DOJ ultimately said, okay, if you do X, Y, and Z, we'll let this deal happen. So in December of 2020, we closed the deal.
Credit as an industry and these big ticket items are, it hasn't changed that much in decades. And then, as you look forward over the next few years, like, how will this industry change, or do you think it's just going to stay the same?
No, I think there is I think we're in that moment now. I think in the next 5 years, the transformation of how a consumer's relationship with money will be redefined via AI. And what I mean by that is, right now, the model is, if you're the top, let's say 1 to 3% of incomes, you have a personal banker, you have a CFA, CPA, you name it, who can help you advise on your money. And the model today works roughly because you generate enough revenue for the bank or whomever to pay that particular person to give you individual advice. And I think that day is coming now where AI can actually do that for the masses. So even when you're helping just generate, pennies worth of incremental revenue, that will be enough to have the AI components manage and give you personalized advice. And I should know, like, that professional that, people have historically had have made mistakes, right? Like, your financial planner is not infallible. And I think in many ways, that opportunity with technology is going to change the way that we have interactions with money. I think that's the first piece. So the advice, sort of the pathing, the planning that we have will be fundamentally better. But I think the second wave of that is now the things that we are too lazy to do, even though we should do them, will also happen automatically, right? So, bill pay is a very simple example, but I'll just use it because like we know we should pay, but sometimes we don't have the funds or the means to do it. But most of the time, or many of the times, or some of the times, depending on where you are, you're just kind of lazy, right? And all of these things get automated, right? And I think the world moves to a place where the mundane and knowing what you should do is very clear. Now it's a function of, do you have the self-control to do it? Do you have the desire to do X, Y, and Z? And where do you ultimately want to be? But I think that's transformative because I think for a long time, there was a lot of confusion in what finances are and what you should do as a consumer. And the tedium of these little small tasks of paying bills on time, doing these like sort of, refinancing your loan, they're kind of painful, right? Like, I don't want to refinance my mortgage to save $50. But if it's an
Automated,
AI,
an AI, an
come on in,
agent.
and like, hey, I'll do all of it
Yeah.
for you, of course I would do that, right? And I think that will, in the next 5 years, will change the way that we think about our relationship with money and advisors.
Yeah, the top 1%, as you say, have access to these people that will recommend these changes, and that's going to be available to a large portion of the population.
I won't say all, right, because it's unclear whether the data and sort of the infrastructure supports that today, but it will change the percentage for sure.
Yeah, I know friends that have updated their they've uploaded their bank statements and their tax forms to ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And they've I've not seen the outputs, but like they said, I got a bunch of pointers that were kind of super useful.
Yeah.
I'm not recommending people kind of upload their stuff there, but it's fairly basic stuff can be pretty intuitive. You just you roll it forward a few years.
Yeah, it still makes
very interesting.
It still makes some mistakes, to your point, and you have to be careful about it. But by and large, advice is actually very good and sound for a vast majority of consumers. And I think, again, that's the beginning. Now, I think some of it is you still have to take a lot of action, right? Like, great, you gave me 6 steps and 6 pointers. I may not want to do those. And I think when you can have those 6 points or steps done for you, I think that becomes really fundamentally significant.
Yeah. And so what's next for Ken Lin? You're out of an operating role. What are you thinking about next? Or not thinking about next?
Well, my goal is just to do nothing for the next 9 to 12 months. I think it's been a 17-year run for me, giving a little bit of space. I have young kids that I'm dying to spend time with, and there are a lot of things you give up or are willing to trade off when you're operating. And I want to make no more trade-offs and really focus on the things that I enjoy doing. And then we'll see. But what's clear for me is what I want to do for the next 9-ish months.
Awesome. Well, well deserved. Well, thanks for joining us today. It's been a terrific conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. This is fun.
Thank you.